Good afternoon. I promised you a PowerPoint presentation that would get us through the 1920s, hopefully setting us up for the Great Depression, just to get us sort of to where we were, hopefully, at the end of Tuesday's lecture, since this is actually Monday before Tuesday, so I'm being optimistic and hoping that we got this far. World War I brings a lot of big changes throughout the world. Frankopan has been talking to you about that. The chapter that you should theoretically have read from him for last week discusses the post-war Middle East, basically the new entry of Soviet Russia as a competitor for Middle Eastern oil, the problems that the war has created through much of Europe itself, the dislocation of a lot of peoples and how those peoples are affecting the Middle East, like the influx of Jewish people, which has started, as I mentioned in class last week, in the late 1800s, escalates markedly through World War I. We tend to associate it with a big problem in World War II, which of course it is, and in the aftermath. But it's already started. By the end of World War I, there are a lot of Jewish people who are leaving Europe and they are moving into Palestine, which at that point in time was still controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And this has led to a lot of problems effectively through World War I, because during the course of World War I, with the Ottoman Empire effectively collapsing, Britain and France both have made promises to different peoples within the Ottoman Empire that if they helped fight for the Entente powers, that they would give them their independence. Unfortunately, though, at the end of the war, it was very clear that oil was going to be the next big thing that everybody needed. And thus, in the Treaty of Versailles, one of the points that came out of it was a creation of the mandate system under the League of Nations, which effectively took big chunks of the Middle East and put them under the control of Britain and France, not allowing them their independence. And this is a big part of where many of our problems, even today, with the Middle East have started. Now, what's going on back in the good old US of A, of course, is that the end of World War I also sees the end of the Progressive Era and an attempt at this point to return to normalcy, as it were. But a lot of things have changed as a byproduct of World War I and the Progressive period before it. So I'm going to start then with this PowerPoint on the social changes in the US. One of the biggest ones, of course, was in the economy. The Second Industrial Revolution, which we've kind of already talked about, creates all kinds of new wonderful things that people want. We've already talked about the increase in the consumer economy, electricity come along to replace steam power, but also then leaving the creation of new devices, appliances, cars, radios, furniture, clothing. Corporations expand. We've already talked about the way the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era both saw the rise of big business. Well, now, within the big business, corporations have created a second tier, the middle managers, the salaried executives, all of these guys who are expanding the size of the middle class, right? Okay, so get us here. I'll go on to 2. Okay, one of the things that comes out of the Second Industrial Revolution, and again as a byproduct of progressivism, was the attempt on the part of many companies to try to keep the government from intruding and to limit the power of labor unions by creating what we refer to as welfare capitalism. They offered their employees stock options, house purchases, insurance options, all kinds of things that today we still think of as the benefits package that comes from being employed by a corporation. Well, a lot of this starts definitely by the Progressive Era, and certainly increases after World War I. The whole idea again of the open shop, where non-union workers got the same rights that the union people got and the same benefits, with an attempt to, again, prevent people from joining unions to control the power of the unions themselves. And then, of course, in the wake of World War I, as a pushback against a lot of what Wilson had done, a lot of his control of the economy for the war effort itself, the federal government returned effectively to a very pro-business stance, very much like that of the Gilded Age. So a lot of that pushback going on there. There you go. Auto industry, of course, the big takeoff point. Henry Ford's River Rouge plant set a standard of a sort with the idea of uniformity, speed, precision, coordination. What Lepore has been talking about in her discussion of Lippmann and the idea of efficiency. This idea that Ford comes up with of creating the assembly line where workers specialize in a particular function, that the product itself, in this case cars, moves down the line. People do different things on it to speed up production and to, again, make it all uniform. At the same time, he creates the idea of the $5 a day wage, the idea also of marketing and advertising, again, the advent of radio, mass publication, and the idea of changing the way the model looks every year so that people want the most recent one. One of the other things he does, of course, is the creation of that $5 wage, which is designed so that his employees could actually afford to purchase cars themselves. And he actually establishes a form of credit so that they can do this. The auto industry itself, a lot of other industries that benefit from it, steel, sheet metal, rubber, glass, petroleum, all of these were necessary for cars. So this was an industry that created subsequent industries. And again, you're going to see Ford do a lot like Rockefeller did in owning or investing in a lot of these secondary businesses. We also have a whole new advent of consumer demand, filling stations, roads. These things are necessary for cars as well. So the government's going to get involved in certainly building roads, and that'll be at the local and state and federal levels. Filling stations, a big part of the new economy, because we now have cars and can go places. We'll see businesses begin to consolidate so that they can offer the consumer one location to go for many things. Thus, the shopping mall, first one of which comes into being in 1924. There you go. Very nice, very big. Advertising, again, particularly with new appliances, refrigerators, washing machines, vacuums. Notice that many of these are marketed to women, with the idea being that these will make a woman's life easier at home, and that men will want to provide these for their wives. Even though we did see women go to work in World War I, most women who could afford to got out of the employment game as soon as they could. So again, to reinforce the point that women have always worked, poor women have always had to work in industry. By the 1920s, with the booming economy that was the post-World War I economy, most women chose not to work if they could. You know, cigarette ads, notice the use of celebrities. Radios and movies boomed, with NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, being the first successful national radio network. Movies themselves, this is the age of black and white movies, but at the same time, they'll start getting sound involved with them. And theaters will be a big place for people to go and congregate. This is the evolution of leisure time, which both of the books talk about as developing in the latter 1800s and certainly continuing into the 1900s, right? Go. The first talkie, Al Jolson's the jazz singer. Radio distribution, notice around the large cities, you're going to be able to get a excuse me, a larger broadcast area. But despite the fact that we call this the Roaring Twenties, it's also a period in which prosperity was limited due to the new competition from electricity, from rising airplane travel and movement of goods, the growth of the petroleum industry, places like railroads, cotton, textile industries, and coal industries will begin to decline. Farmers themselves, who had boomed during World War I because they were feeding not just the United States and the U.S. Army in Europe, but also Europeans, began to see a decline in the demand for their products as Europe begins to rebound and as the arbitrary prices that had been set during World War I are eliminated. So back into the um, problem with competition, as it were. Union membership drops again. The radical socialism of Eugene V. Debs and its association with communism and what's going on with the Russian Revolution and some of the discontent scattered throughout Europe in the wake of World War I, and the fact that so many European nations are seeing an economic downturn due to the costs of recovering from World War I. In the North, we began to see the beginnings of what's referred to as the Great Migration, many African Americans moving north, but again, even there, still being disqualified from anything other than menial labor and still facing racism. We talk about the Jim Crow South, but again, a lot of those ideas, particularly the racist ideas of separate but equal, have traveled into north as well. Growth in income in the middle class unequal, again, not expanding. It is, the middle class is expanding, but it doesn't take in everybody, right? So the Jazz Age, we still see, even though women have passed and gotten the right to vote as of 1920, still having problems with the Equal Rights Amendment. Instead, a lot of what we see, and we talk about 1920, as I've mentioned before, being that decade in which the census demonstrates that half of the U.S. population lives in rural areas or still involved in farming, but 20%, or half of them don't. The other 50% are now mostly living in large urban areas. So as a result, to a certain extent, of World War I and some of the disillusionment in the aftermath of World War I, a lot of young women particularly began to push back against the expectations that were placed on them by their parents and their grandparents. You see the rise of flappers, the shorter dresses, the idea of this rather risque dance mechanism, women going out to clubs, particularly the speakeasies, which were, of course, a creation of prohibition, as people were not supposed to drink. Illegal clubs pop up throughout urban areas that provide illegal alcohol, and many young women will become part of that underground pushback as flappers. Divorce rates doubled as many women decided they were unhappy with the lifestyle they were living. But again, these were young women in urban areas, and quite often their flappery lifestyle would change when they found the right man to propose to them. They would get married and prefer, again, that return to the security of the traditional life as a mother, as a stay-at-home wife, etc. There you go. There you go. Female workers after World War I, pretty much again limited to teachers, nurses, and other low-paying jobs. It's with the rise of the malls and corporations that many women and many companies discover that they prefer to have women working behind counters because women are more approachable, less intimidating, and often more likely to be able to convince male customers what to buy for their women. Birth control on the rise since the latter 1800s, now available particularly for middle and upper class women to help them control their family size. And with industry now, there is less need for large families. And in fact, large families are often a hindrance, as we talked about prior with the Gilded Age and even in the Progressive Era. One of the big problems for many women, particularly poor women, was what to do with their children while they were working. And the desire to limit the number of children they have for the purpose of supporting them and being able to feed them leads many women into exploring birth control. We also see the rise in this idea of adolescence, that there's a particular period of time where young people push back, as it were, against the expectation of their parents. There's a specific time period in which they can be young people. Many of them push back again with alcohol, again, illegal alcohol, rise in premarital sex, and searching for new forms of excitement. There you go. F. Scott Fitzgerald's popular novel kind of puts some of this into manifestation. The Harlem Renaissance, very much an interesting post-World War I effect. A lot of African Americans in the area of Harlem, New York, began their own cultural explosion. The creation of jazz and blues, very distinctive American musical styles. Louis Armstrong becomes very popular. Langston Hughes with poetry, much of which promoted the idea of racial equality, condemning racism itself, but also discussing the idea that African American culture was unique and distinct in itself and should be respected and appreciated for that, certainly by African Americans themselves. Josephine Baker was an American who actually moved to France in the wake of World War I because she was allowed more freedom there to perform. There you go. Be black and proud, politically assertive, and economically independent, creative, and disciplined. At least it seemed that way, certainly if you were in Harlem itself. Within that, though, we also see the rise socially of a form of American pessimism. T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Sinclair Lewis, a lot of these were men who had fought in World War I, came back as disillusioned about the nature of modern warfare and modern society as the Europeans, as their European counterparts. Gene O'Neill with plays, Gershwin and Copeland with music. Again, this idea that this wealth that we were seeing, again, not producing anything of true value in terms of attitudes about the world, intellectualism, or this idea of progress, as it were. There you go. Main Street, particularly a pushback against the rural attitudes, particularly that of just not being open-minded, that this was a return to the idea that capitalism was the best and only way. There you go, Great Gatsby, Human Emptiness, and to a certain extent, the idea of the rugged romantic individual, but with that violence. And again, a byproduct of World War I. So, Marcus Garvey rises in the 1920s as a preeminent civil rights activist. Ultimately, he would form the United Negro Improvement Association, but interestingly, advocated that African Americans should leave the United States and return to Africa to create a distinctly African society without the racism or problems that African Americans suffered in the United States itself. There you go. The Black Star Line. W. Du Bois argued the other side of it, that African Americans deserved equality, racial equality, that they should not give in to this idea of separate but equal. So, all right, with that in mind then, the rural counterattack, some of this we've talked about already, obviously. The rise of urbanization, skyscrapers as a byproduct of the steel industry. There you go, New York in 1930. The shift towards the urban lifestyle, which brings into play what in the 1920s would be a very distinct debate about American culture itself. The very conservative rural areas versus the more liberal urban areas, and in this case I'm using that distinctly in the way that we talked about conservative and liberal. The conservative factions liking things the way they were, not wanting change, but young people, particularly in the larger urban areas, wanted massive change. They wanted to overturn prohibition. They wanted more freedom to do what they wanted without the expectations of living the life their parents had lived, right? Rural Americans tended to identify the cities with drinking, immorality, the threat of overturning the traditional U.S. Way of capitalism, and just generally a life without morality at all. We saw, and Lepore talks distinctly about the attempt to restore the Protestant culture in America, and as a byproduct of that, the attacks on what they considered un-American behavior, like, again, drinking, illiteracy, and immigration. And I like the emphasis here on illiteracy, that it is an American way of life to be able to read. This is something that has come about as a byproduct of the Second Industrial Revolution and the increase throughout the country of mandatory primary education. That people needed to go at least through the 6th grade. There you go. Prohibition passed in 1920, the 18th Amendment. Rural America itself became very dry, even though there were still moonshiners around, people who produced illegal alcohol in their homegrown stills. But a lot of where they sold to was into urban areas, not necessarily into the local countryside. So there you go. The social disease of drunkenness. There's your statewide prohibitions, when it was passed, and how. Notice the ones that came before 1900, and then again going through that. This is prior, of course, to 1920, when the Volstead Act made it illegal anywhere. Of course, one of the big arguments for doing away with drinking was that it would decrease crime. In actuality, it does exactly the opposite. We see the rise of organized crime as a mechanism for getting alcohol into the country and moving it around to various and sundry places where it could be illegally sold. So organized crime definitely on the rise in the 1920s, the creation of mobs and mob families who could make this happen. And of course, once they start moving alcohol, they figure out other things to move and sell as well. There you go. Illegal selling of alcohol again. Notice that the consumption pattern only really drops in the first year and then begins to return almost to what it had been prior to the passage of Prohibition in 1920. Maybe not quite reaching what it was in 1910, but certainly getting back up there. And again, all of that was illegal. Here you go, your basic speakeasies, private clubs where people could get alcohol, and of course, Al Capone, right? The KKK, which had been disbanded when Reconstruction ended in the 1870s, we see a rise again in the 1915, well, in the 19-teens, certainly into the 1920s, but this time under the argument that it wasn't so much to instill slavery, but to reinforce racism, particularly to protect rural Christian values. And by that we mean the Protestant values. Again, Lepore does a really good job talking about the rise of evangelicalism in this period as well. There you go. Yeah. Imperial Palace, Stone Mountain. So the second rebirth in Stone Mountain, Georgia, was aimed not just at African Americans, but now expanded its targets to include immigrants, Jewish people, Catholic people, prostitutes, pretty much anybody that it deemed immoral or non-American. They did, however, resort to their tried and true tactics: violence, kidnapping, murder, and influencing politics by sponsoring candidates, particularly at the local and state levels, to run. There you go. They also expanded so that it wasn't just men who could join the KKK. They had secondary orders like the Women's Order, the Junior Order for Boys, the Tri-K Club for Girls, and the Crusaders for Assimilated Immigrants. Over the 10-year period from 1915 to 1925, they were particularly active. There was a lot of violence directed at any of these other groups, but much of that was met with resistance from at the federal level, leading to a decline in Klan membership by 1925. There you go. Governors elected with Klan support: Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, but also notice Oregon, California, Kansas, Colorado, not just in the South. And then, of course, major areas of Klan violence, but many of those were in the South. The birth of the nation in 1915, set during the Civil War, in theory, obviously made in 1915, so it wasn't made during the Civil War, but its objective was to use that as a platform for glorifying white supremacy and the success of the KKK. So there you go. Woodrow Wilson. The biggest post-World War I effect, though, was the first Red Scare. Now, we assume the Red Scare, we tend to think of it as what happens after World War II in the 1950s with McCarthyism, but there actually is a first Red Scare in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution that gets the Soviet Union out of World War I, this Red Scare, due to many of the laws, like the Alien and Sedition Act, which was passed towards the end of World War I. The federal government, but also a number of local governments, used the fear of radicalism as a mechanism to control people. General workers' strikes in Seattle, the police strike in Boston, mail bombs sent particularly to members of the federal government, particularly in the FBI, led to a fear of anarchy particularly, and the idea that communist groups were looking to overthrow government and to force people in the United States to become communist. Thus, as a byproduct, again, of the Alien and Sedition Acts, you see a rise in the deportation without due process, searches without warrants, imprisonment of innocent people, used against particularly immigrants, but also against a number of United States citizens themselves. Anybody who spoke out at this point in time about criticizing the government in any way quite often was associated with being a communist or being literally a radical, and thus often just literally arrested, put on a ship, and sent out of the country. So this was a period of high anxiety, but also a period of high conformity, as people were very much afraid to do anything to criticize the government in any way. There you go. It's Soviet arc, sending them back to the Soviet Union. Ship or shoot. There you go. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial, again, these two men found guilty and executed without any real evidence. The biggest crime, or the biggest reason for conviction, was hysteria against immigrants in the period. So, there you go. Anarchist bastards. And of course, the fundamentalist challenge coming out of the rural areas. Scopes monkey trial, which we have already talked about, the idea that teaching evolution in school was wrong. And again, I really like what Lepore does with that section in the book where she talks about the hypothetical conversation between Jefferson and Bryan with Socrates to determine literally the distrust in the American public, as it were. So there you go. So, urban America came to define the United States in the 20s, mainly because of its economy, the availability of appliances, consumer goods, the increase in the movement of many peoples into urban areas, and the conservatives, particularly in the South, but scattered throughout the country, push back with ideas of religious fundamentalism in the KKK. So, on that note, let's talk about the politics of the 1920s. I've mentioned to you before that whole idea of the pendulum, how we tend to move from left to right and back, or from conservative to um, liberal, depending. One side will be in power, a number of laws will get passed. Eventually, the consensus will be reached that they've gone too far, and there'll be the swing back. The other side gets control. The 1920s, in many ways, are a return to the Gilded Age, in that, once again, Republicans will dominate the White House and both houses of Congress, and they will be pushing back against the progressive reforms, particularly the ones driving the economy. They will definitely reinstill the Gilded Age ideas of the close relationship between government and business, and definitely advocate a foreign policy based on economic investment of the United States throughout the world. And one of the big parts of this will be the Dawes Plan, which was the major investment in helping Europe rebuild. There you go. Harding in 1920 wins over Woodrow Wilson on his campaign of a return to normalcy. His focus and the focus of his years in office would be on corruption, and particularly on the idea of cutting back government spending, increasing protective tariffs, and reducing income tax. So in many ways, again, as Lepore tells you, this becomes a big part of the foundation of even modern day U.S. politics, as it were. So there you go. The Teapot Dome scandal, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall accepted a bribe effectively to lease national oil reserves to businesses. And this was a very big deal. There you go. Wyoming, Teapot Dome. Harding himself died in 1923, putting Silent Hal, Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge, into the presidency, and he won his own term in 1924, known particularly for his honesty and integrity, but unfortunately he himself was not very effective as a leader. He would, however, continue Harding's policies of less government spending, attempting to lower the income tax, and limiting congressional legislation, particularly legislation that impinged in the business world. There you go. Just sit down and be still. Here you go, 1924 election. Notice, I'm going to draw your attention right here. We still have a progressive, and we still have a third party. La Follette with his laboratory of democracy in Wisconsin. So progressivism is still around as an idea. It's still out there, and it still is getting a certain amount of the vote. There you go. Not enough to actually have any real weight, but the ideology is still there, and that's part of the point with those third parties, right? Democrats, however, began the process of splitting. You have your rural Democrats in the South and the West, who favored prohibition, traditional Protestant values, and the Klan, but urban Democrats were mostly immigrants. So this makes for a very interesting combination, particularly at the Democratic National Convention, where the presidential nomination definitely demonstrates the divide between the two factions of the Democratic Party. Thus, they ended up compromising on John Davis of West Virginia as their candidate. There you go. And not surprisingly, don't get very far. Notice that La Follette did get 13 electoral votes, and a lot of that is because that was Wisconsin. There you go. All righty, here you go. 1928 election. Hoover running as the Republican candidate, Alfred Smith as the Democratic candidate. Hoover himself was Protestant, Smith was Catholic, and this is going to be the first Catholic candidate running for a major party. Hoover, of course, continuing the Republican ideal of being for the maintenance of prohibition. Smith, however, looking to overturn the 18th Amendment. Hoover, native-born, Alfred Smith, the son of immigrants, even though he himself was not. There we go. Hoover, self-made millionaire, committed to business and volunteerism, and Smith rose through Tammany Hall, an area, the seat of the Democratic Party in New York. Smith himself would appeal to new voters in cities, but alienated the old line Democrats, particularly with his Catholicism. So, there we go. But it does reveal the new urban voting bloc. Democrats won the majority of the votes in the 12 largest U.S. cities. So even though they didn't win, notice, and this is another interesting point, that Smith carries the South. And one of the biggest reasons for this, of course, is the association still of the Democratic Party with the post-Civil War conservative white Democrats that controlled the South, especially after Reconstruction, but attempted to control the South during Reconstruction, right? But were precluded. So there you go. Hoover, interestingly enough, we associate Hoover with the Great Depression, which is actually kind of sad because in and of itself, Hoover himself was one of the most effective of the Republican presidents, particularly in the 1920s. He believed in free enterprise, tried to strengthen U.S. trade by bringing more business and government relations together, doubled the size of the U.S. bureaucracy, created the bureaus to oversee housing, transportation, and mining. And much of this was, again, to try to limit the power of unions and to have the government be, in some respects, more able to help people. There you go. He had served as the head of Wilson's Food Administration during World War I and as the Commerce Secretary for Harding and Coolidge. So he was also a very experienced man. Interestingly, he also, while head of the while being the Commerce Secretary, actually wrote a paper in which he argued that we were going to see exactly what happened going into the Great Depression. He didn't know when it would happen, and unfortunately for him, it happened while he was president, which is part of why he was not reelected. It was because of the collapse of Wall Street in '29. So there you go. So the old and the new, urban culture and industrial production dominated in the 20s in many respects as it had during the Gilded Age. Mass-produced consumer goods, mass media, advertising spread through American culture. And again, I think Lepore does a wonderful job talking about this in her chapter on the mass culture and efficiency, as it were. In the rural areas, however, there was still an attempt to cling to what they considered to be their traditional way. And progressive reforms were no match for technology and prosperity. Again, a big part of what Lepore is talking about in her chapter. Okay, so one of the things that Frankopin closes with in chapter 18 is his statement that things are changing, that the empires are changing. The reality, however, was that the tide had already turned. The power and influence of the West was in decline and seemed certain to diminish further. There was a price to pay for constant interference in local affairs. There was a price to pay for remodeling the gardens of the embassy, and there was a price to pay for never quite playing with a straight bat. That price was reservation, misgivings, and mistrust. This is on page 344, the last page in chapter 18, The Road to Compromise. And it's talking about, in the wake of World War I, how the need for what in the chapter before that Frankopin refers to as black gold or oil has shifted the way things operate. World War I was a pivotal point for the understanding that oil was going to be the new next big thing that everybody was going to need, certainly in terms of military technology. And the European empires themselves had for a very long time not been playing fair with people. Again, making promises, as most of them did in World War I, to let people, particularly the Ottoman Empire, have their independence. If you remember, and I know you do, one of the reasons for World War I was the rise in nationalism and imperialism, how the two things were conflicting. And in the wake, again, of World War I, we're going to see the empire still clinging desperately to these areas that they have tried to control for so long. But the thing is, people are changing. Now, how does that relate to the United States? Well, the United States obviously has been building its own little empire. We talked about that with the lead up to World War I, the age of U.S. imperialism, as it were. And a lot of that's going to come crashing to a head with the Great Depression. We tend to think of this as something that is just a part of United States history, but it has major worldwide ramifications. Again, because in the aftermath of World War I, in hopes of recouping a lot of the debt that we had allowed other countries to create, a lot of the money we wanted to get back, we invested very heavily in rebuilding much of Europe, starting effectively with Germany. The Dawes Plan put into effect the idea that we would loan a lot of money into corporations and businesses that would open in Germany in hopes of getting the German economy rebooted so that they could start paying back the reparations that were part of the Versailles Treaty, right? So going into the Great Depression, a lot of this is because of the grand overextension of credit that we have been giving for decades now, not just in Europe, but throughout the world and in the United States itself, right? All right, so here we go. As a prelude to the stock market crash, we had a working understanding that there were problems. We already had a recession in place in 1927, but most government and business leaders ignored the warning signs. Now, I'm going to point out to you that the Federal Reserve already exists. It existed in the wake, it came into being in the wake of the Great Depression that started with the Panic of 1893. Again, the idea with the Federal Reserve was to adjust interest rates, the same thing it does today, to adjust interest rates in hopes of encouraging people to invest or deterring people from investing. But unfortunately, speculators are still out there. Now, what are speculators? They are people who buy stock on the margin, as in they use what they think is going to be their profit margin from selling of stock to take out loans to buy other stocks. They don't actually sell the stock. They take out a loan from the bank based on the potential profit they'll make. But this presupposes the market's going to stay static, which of course it doesn't. There you go. The initial stock market crash on October 24th, Black Thursday, leads effectively to a catastrophic drop in stocks on October 29th, Black Tuesday. What happens in this particular case is that panicked investors sell their stock, leading to the stock prices collapsing. Now, the thing is, as with any panic moment like this, and as with the stock, as in with the stock market itself, not everybody in the country is invested in the stock market. Certainly not in the 1920s. These are primarily wealthy people and other large corporations, particularly banks. As I try to explain quite often, banks themselves are for-profit businesses. They are not out there making money on your money. Well, they are making money on your money being there. They're making money by taking the money that you have in your checking account or in your savings account and investing it for themselves. That's part of why they pay you dividends on your savings account, but they charge you even larger prices on your loans, right? Definitely looking to make as much money off of you as they can. But where things go to the bad is that because so many banks have invested in the stock market, when those stock market figures go down, when stock prices drop, that means banks lose money. People in turn, people who aren't invested in the stock market, panic, and this is why we talk about it starting with a panic, with fear that banks at this point in time would go out of business and that they would lose all of their money. So many people would rush into the banks to get their money, Literally, the whole idea behind the dollar is that it is supposed to be the equivalent of the same exchange point of actual gold and silver. People would rush into banks to cash their bills in to get gold or silver out. Banks often didn't have as much gold and silver on hand as was necessary, because this was a period when we were still on the gold standard, and thus would have to shut down for the afternoon while they got the mother bank, the central bank, to send them more gold and silver, but then this would lead to even more panic on the part of consumers who hadn't rushed in that first day, and they in turn would be there the next morning and want it. So this would eventually lead ultimately to banks having to close. The cycle, as it is here, and I like it. Banks lent less money because they didn't have it to lend. Factories themselves would start producing less as the buying public bought less. As they produced less, they would lay off workers, who in turn would no longer be able to buy things, which means there would be even fewer consumers buying things. And it just creates this great big spiral down, which ultimately would lead to factories and businesses closing because they couldn't stay in business, right? So it's this great cycle. And notice I like this particular graph. Here's your roaring 20s, and then Black Tuesday, then the big plunge, short recovery periods, but then more and more plunges. In effect, the true market doesn't recover until literally the 1950s as a byproduct of World War II. And this is the market bottoming it out in 32. Which is when Roosevelt's going to come in with his New Deal in an attempt to stabilize the U.S. economy. There you go. So originally, the stock market itself only had about 10, 15, 20% of the entire American economy, but it's the spiral that drags everybody else down with it. There you go. Stock speculators. Unemployment, of course, from 1929 to 1942. Notice again, 42, when we enter the war, is when things are going to begin to pick up for us. There you go. Unemployment at 32% or 25% by 1932. So the biggest reasons for the Depression, and again, many reasons. It's a confluence of things happening at one time. Overproduction is a big one, particularly of consumer durable goods and agriculture, which drives those prices down. Post-war conditions in Europe, which decreased their ability to buy our products, again, another problem. Unequal distribution of wealth, much of it centered at a very small percent of people at the top. High consumer debt, people taking out more and more credit cards, going into debt to buy appliances, cars, all of those things, and massive overspeculation in the stock market itself. So massive decrease in consumer purchasing power. There you go. There you go. So this nice little chart kind of gives you the biggest causes of the Great Depression. But notice, again, how they fall into play with these three big categories and the smaller things that go into them. Right? So debt bubbles, again, speculation being a big part of it. So, and again, we'll see this happen again and again from this point out. And again, it happened in 1893. So again, about every 20, 25 years, we see one of these credit collapses, credit spirals that leads to an economic recession and or depression. It hits all classes. Many families lost their homes or farms when banks foreclosed, forced to live in what people at the time referred to as Hoovervilles, blaming Herbert Hoover for the collapse of the economy. These would effectively be what we today would call shanty towns, cardboard box places, people living anywhere that they could find to live. Unprecedented poverty, definitely a rise in suicide rates, fathers abandoning their families, leaving mothers to have to take care of the children on their own. There would be attempts at relief efforts, but on the part of the federal government, most of it was minimal under Hoover. It would only be under Roosevelt and his New Deal that we would see a major increase. African Americans particularly hit hard in the North, among the first to be laid off. Mexican immigrants also faced serious competition and deportation from angry Americans. Middle class hit particularly hard, mainly hurt by pride. Refused to take relief checks or any kind of charity. Many lost their homes. Health care itself declined as doctors and dentists were considered to be luxuries at this point in time. So there you go. Soup kitchens, bread lines, churches particularly became prominent places for charity, providing food quite often for working men and for their families. This is one of my favorite images. Image from the 1920s promoting this idea of the United States having the highest standard of living, and then a bread and soup line literally in front of it. There you go. Mortgage foreclosures as banks started calling in loans. Again, people living pretty much anywhere they could. So, yeah, extreme poverty, not able to do anything. This is complicated and will be further complicated in the 1930s by the Dust Bowl, the natural disaster that led to the collapse of farming in the Midwest, people packing up everything they had in their vehicles and moving anywhere they thought they could get help. The freight train hopping, creation of hobos, big in this period, people trying to move from one place to another just to find work, any kind of work at all. So yeah. Hoovervilles, the creation of these itinerant neighborhoods effectively inside near industrial areas and large urban places. People, again, desperately looking for work or anywhere to live. So, as I said, Hoover himself believed that the economy would right itself if given enough time. He rejected the idea again of the federal government stepping in a big way and called instead for volunteerism. Charities, local governments, businesses to put out helping hands to do what they could to help people. Hoover himself would eventually call for government projects like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, designed to loan money to failing businesses to try to keep them in business. Sorry. Yeah, good old rugged individualism. The creation of federal government-sponsored projects to put people to work, like the creation of the Hoover Dam. There you go. This was, however, not enough, especially by 1932. The Bonus Army, World War I veterans who effectively marched to Washington in hopes of getting Congress to give them their bonus checks. These were checks that they were given for fighting in World War I, but they were not supposed to be available for 20 years. It was like a future bond, basically. The Bonus Army situation turns to the bad when, because of the creation of the bonus shantytown, the people of Washington, D.C. actually call upon the president to do something about getting rid of them. He calls out the Army, and in a series of very bad efforts, the U.S. Army ends up firing on former Army veterans and their families. Initially, this was an attempt to drive them out of Washington, D.C. proper by using gas grenades, but the attempt goes to the bad and a number of people end up dying, including a small child. So not the best look for Hoover or for the Army itself. There you go. Bonus Army. MacArthur and Eisenhower involved in that particular horrific event. Bank failures also continue by 32, a big increase in them in 1933, which also does not look good. And then, of course, the Dust Bowl, which starts in 31, increasing the situation as great dust clouds. Well, as the wind basically whips the topsoil off the land, leading farmers in the Midwest to literally lose everything they had. So, the heart of it. So yeah, people move literally anywhere they could in hopes of finding work. Oklahoma and Arkansas worst hit as people pack up and move along Route 66 in hopes of finding work anywhere. So the inability of the Republicans to find any way of helping the American public basically opens the door wide for a Democratic takeover of not just national but also local politics, where with the plan put forth effectively by Hoover with the New Deal, will draw most Americans in to vote for them. So there you go. All right, so that gets us then effectively to the beginnings of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And as I mentioned before, the catastrophic effects of the Depression on the United States are not alone. It is bad here, but it is worse everywhere else in the world, particularly in Europe, where the United States loans through the Dawes Act and investment through the building of corporations, particularly multinational corporations, leads to the collapse of many economies, starting almost immediately with the collapse of the German economy under the Weimar Republic, which will lead ultimately to the rise of other ideas about how to control economics, which we'll see most prominently in fascism. So when we come back next week, part of what I want to do is start you with a discussion of the New Deal of the 1930s, how the United States handles economic collapse, but we'll also talk about the rise of alternate plans like fascism in Europe, which is a different type of economy. It's very much a state-controlled economy designed effectively to boost the economy by the government spending great amounts of money. But in this case, a lot of what the government's going to spend it on is going to be militarization. So we will talk about that and why fascism begins to look so good. And it even looks good in the United States, where the U.S. develops its own fascist party in the 1930s as a response to a lot of the New Deal government control of the economy. So we will start there next week. Please keep up with the readings. As I mentioned, the Frankman stuff is really good because it's giving us the world view of what's going on in this period of the 1920s. And then Lepore, of course, talking also about the events that will get us into the Great Depression, through the Great Depression and into World War II.